What's up, guys? It is looks like August 21st today, 2017. I'm going to do some Q&A follow-up from the thread this morning. And last couple weeks I've been doing, just trying to limit it to 6 to 8 questions, give or take. I think we might have had around 8 or 9 today, but I've been trying to limit it so the videos aren't, 20 or 30 minutes long. So let's jump into this. And there's some good ones again. I keep getting a really good variety, so I'm liking these for sure. First one is thoughts on Lyle's stubborn fat loss protocol at the tail end of a prep. And Lyle, as in Lyle McDonald, for those of you that didn't know that. And so basically the stubborn fat protocol, he's basically talking about his cardio strategy, and more or less what this is you are mobilizing fatty acids and then you are burning off fatty acids. So it's basically doing HIIT cardio, more or less, resting for about 5 minutes, just gathering yourself, and then following that up with a moderate steady state, not a super slow steady state, but something below the lactate threshold, so you're not like melting your legs off like you are with the original HIIT session, but it's not snail pace. And that in which case you are burning off those fatty acids that are mobilized. And then Yohimbine HCl comes into that, and he has a dosing strategy as far as how much, and I'm not going to go into all that, but because it's easy to Google, you can Google and see the whole protocol online. But I think that it is, I think that's definitely something that you could use. It's something that I've used on myself, and something that I've used on other people. Actually, I remember distinctly, it was prep in 2010, I think. I was working with Jason Theobald at the time, and that's when I first learned about it, because I know he uses, I don't know if he still does, but I know he had me use it at the time. And the theory, on paper, it's always made sense to me to mobilize the fatty acids and then burn them off. That's always made sense to me. I think it's a solid protocol. It should be helpful. So now, obviously, this is fasted, guys. If you didn't realize that, this is fasted. And yes, you can do HIIT fasted. There's people that do it all the time. So don't freak out. But combining that with your Yohimbine protocol in a fasted state, I definitely think is effective, for sure. So yes, I say go for it if you want. Thoughts on, and I might butcher this, Sibutramine ability to reduce the rate of negative metabolic adaptions. So basically what that is it's a prescription, at least it is in the US, I think, more or less used as an appetite suppressant. A lot of people compare it to phentermine, and it's not exactly the same, but it has a lot of similar effects. It's basically a SNRI drug, I want to say. It's not an SSRI, SNRI, serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor, which is more or less an antidepressant of sorts, but in this case it's used for appetite suppressant. And what he's talking about are metabolic adaptions. It does have some ability to reduce the rate of metabolic adaptions, in which we know metabolic adaptions can slow down fat loss, because your body's basically creating these negative adaptions to compensate for a calorie deficit, for activity, your cardio, or whatever it is, and your body wants to reduce the amount of calories that you're burning, so it slows your metabolism down, your hormones downregulate, and so on and so forth. So the literature, I believe most of the literature is on obese individuals. I could be wrong. There might be some on average to fit individuals, but a lot of these drugs are going to be used, especially phentermine. When you see that, it's typically going to be prescribed to an obese individual for appetite suppressant, for some extreme calorie deficit. But I've just seen a lot of nasty sides to it, and those are the typical sides that you're going to have from any SNRI or SSRI. And I just don't like I don't like these strong effects on the neurotransmitters in the long term, because the issue here is the phentermine is typically a really short-term drug, and the sibutramine is typically longer term. They'll prescribe that year-round or long-term. If you're relating it to any other SNRI or SSRI or similar serotonin type drug, it creates some imbalances. So coming off of it might not be that pleasant. There's some other things over the counter that can help offset adaptions. Not as strong. I mean, in a really short run, it might be okay. I don't think there's any way to tell, because I'm not sure that there's any literature, with it being used in that exact scenario. I would say someone would have to try it and see if it works. I mean, I would say it's probably more so dose dependent and time dependent. In a shorter term, might not be a huge deal. In a longer term, it's just going to be harder to stop. It's going to take longer to normalize. And having used an SNRI from my doctor and SSRIs and stuff when I was younger, I mean, all those things, they take time to readjust for sure. Thoughts on sweeteners causing internal inflammation? Some are against them, and they have zero effect on my ability to get in shape. I can tell if I go ape shit with them, I get gassy. However, they don't seem to hold any water per se or hinder fat loss. I use stevia, so you can touch on the others as well, if you please. And then someone else asks, also like to hear about this. I use a lot of Splenda. Zero is just getting lean or water retention, but sometimes gassy. This is really person dependent and dose dependent too. I think in general for most people, there is a little bit of water retention with artificial sweeteners. Even stevia to an extent, though I found that you can get away with a lot more stevia than you can with something like sucralose or aspartame, but it'll still have an effect if you have enough of it. And I would say the best way to tell is just cut them all out and see if it makes any difference. I mean, the people that hold water on them, I mean, it's noticeable. Like if you're really lean, when you see differences in the mirror, half a pound is going to look vastly different because you're so lean. Most of the people I see, when they cut them out, the day after, like, they're noticeably sharper, pretty quick. So, that's not something you're seeing, then it's probably not really affecting you. Now, if it's really if you're really getting gassy on them, that is interrupting digestion to an extent. And though it's not really interrupting your fat loss per se, it's going to interrupt, gut microbiome, and could cause some other issues. Yeah. It's been a long day. And, that in itself could be an issue. So I would say in moderation, they're probably okay. And if you're really hammering them, cut them out a week out. Maybe not even a week out. I mean, a couple days out, you're going to be fine. It's all going to clear out. Cut them out a couple days out. Water intake's high. It's going to clear everything out. But those people that it affects, they're going to know. And like I said, just do a test run and you'll know. Whey protein around training with carbs from powders. Any benefits if you stay zero carb rest of the day? Thoughts are using fat for energy and loading the body with carbs when needed. So basically this is nutrient timing. And if they're referring to fat loss, then yeah. I mean, nutrient partitioning around those times, that it could be beneficial. I mean, you're more insulin sensitive. The carbs are going to potentially should partition better and go where you want them. But at the end of the day, we know that a calorie deficit is the biggest thing here. So I would say that I like the idea of this just because you're going to utilize the carbs better, and you're probably going to feel better the rest of the day without the ups and downs of blood sugar spiking and dropping and spiking and dropping. A lot of people seem to feel better on lower carbs during the day. And fats, it's a little bit smoother. And then carbs around training. It's a minute detail that will make a difference to a minute extent, but, it matters. I mean, and you didn't really specify whether this was fat loss or muscle growth. So in an off-season situation too, I mean, if it can help you maintain insulin sensitivity longer, you're going to potentially take more of the calories that you're eating and utilize them in a better way. Build more muscle, less fat. You're still gaining the same amount of weight, but the ratio is better. You know, if you're more insulin sensitive, it's going to be better, of course. So that could be one way to help with that. All right, next one. Yeah. Damn allergies. Eek. God. Okay. I'm going to cover, actually, there's two of them here that I'm going to cover together. I'm going to try to keep this to the point because this could be super long. What do you think is the most effective GH and insulin protocol for muscle growth? Do you take GH and insulin together at the same time? And is it more effective to dose and administer insulin based upon blood glucose readings throughout the day rather than a flat dosing protocol? If so, would you? What would be your preferred way of doing this? Okay. First off, he says best insulin GH protocol. There's a lot of factors to consider, but I'm just going to go with one here and not give every single scenario. Probably the best, more aggressive one would be using a basal insulin plus GH plus a fast-acting insulin also. And going back to the other question, based upon blood glucose readings, should it be based upon BG readings or a flat dosing protocol? So with the basal, usually that's more so used to arrest beta cells and to offset some insulin resistance. The fast acting is in and out so quickly that it's not that great for insulin resistance. Partitioning it's really good for, but not quite as good as the basal in terms of the blood sugar control, just because it's the basal will last all day long. So with the basal, typically, the starting dose is going to depend on how high your blood glucose is, but something in the ballpark of 4 to 5, maybe 6-ish, 2 times a day of Lantus. That's going to be the most common one. It's pretty common. Start on the low, you could always start on the lower end and then retest 2 times a day because it's not quite 24 hours and it's pretty easy. 2 times a day would just be a little bit easier and cover the whole 24. So, start there, retest fasted glucose and post-meal glucose if you want, and see if it's lowering it. If not, add, maybe add 1 IU per dosing and keep going till you hit the sweet spot, till you have good blood glucose readings. That would be the goal. And then how much growth hormone you add into that would also alter that, because it's going to create more and more insulin resistance the more you add in. It's going to raise your blood sugar more and more. So at a really low dose, maybe 2 units once a day or twice a day even, it's not going to raise it a ton, most likely, not most people, maybe a little bit over time. But, start going higher than that, it might be more. And again, that will depend on the person also, how many carbohydrates are they eating and all that stuff, all the other stuff that causes insulin resistance along with it. So that would kind of be the basal. And then the fast acting would be, you could do it around training if you wanted, or around the bigger carb boluses, carb bolus like a intra-workout. So you could do like the pre-workout dose, post-workout dose, and then if you had carbs in another meal, you could even do the third dose. And, it's going to be the typical 10-ish carbs per unit type of deal, maybe 8-ish carbs depending on the person. The basal is not going to play into that a whole lot just because it's so slow acting that it's not really going to cause any hypo issues. And the basal is not really going to control the big carb burst very well just because it's so slow trickling. The fast acting will control that better, and partition better. So in that case, you would almost just use the fast acting just like anyone else would use it. Common ways, the pre-workout and the post-workout around those times, it could still stay there just as it would. normally, and that's going to get some extra. That's going to actually add to the partitioning benefit and the hypertrophy benefit when combined with the growth hormone. Combined is key. One or the others doesn't really have much hypertrophy benefit on their own. Taking them together, you could separate them. There's some mechanisms that would lead me to believe that it might be beneficial to separate them, but it gets hard when you have a basal and a fast acting in there. I mean, there's going to be overlap somewhere. There's absolutely going to be overlap. It's just not really possible to prevent that. So I wouldn't split hairs on that too much. Maybe split up the GH dosing a couple times a day. That's the long and short. That's the long and short of it, and the short version of it. Any specific time? Oh, so missed one. Missed two. Logbook, a must or only for beginners? I think a logbook could be good for anyone. I use one. I think that I don't use it in every phase though. I don't really use it in deloads. Some phases I don't use it in. It kind of depends on the phase for me, but I think it can be useful for anyone. When you're trying to progressively overload or just keep track of numbers in general, I think it's a good thing. Could make things less complicated or just not as hard to remember. I think that it's perfectly fine for anyone to use, and some people that have trouble with progression, I definitely suggest that they try to use one, and then it'll at least hold them accountable. So, yeah, I think it's perfectly fine to use and can be beneficial. For people that measure blood glucose numbers, have you ever seen or know if there's any correlation between their readings and the person's carb tolerance for the body composition? The person that has lower blood glucose might have better carb tolerance, and so on and so forth. Now, when I followed up with this and I asked, are you saying that blood glucose looks pretty good 2 hours after a meal, a carb meal? And they said, yeah. So they said, yes, for example, I will pull mine between an hour to 2 hours after a 70-gram carb meal, average around 90s. Hour post carbs meals, 80s. Okay, so remember that a couple things are going to determine how quickly it baselines what kind of carbs you're having. Are there fat in the meal? How much protein's in the meal? More complex carbs are going to take a little longer to clear or baseline again versus a simpler carb. But I mean, in general, whatever your fasted blood glucose is, most people will stabilize around that about 2 hours after a meal. It's going to be close to that range. Your pancreas is really what's controlling that because it's more of an insulin response, whereas your morning glucose can be your pancreas, but also your liver because it will produce glucose overnight to maintain stable blood sugar, and it will sometimes produce a little bit more in the morning to get you ready, wake you up ready for the day. That dawn phenomenon. So I mean, if you're talking 2 hours after a meal and your blood sugar's in the 90s, I mean, that's pretty good. It's normal. It should be relatively normal. It's going to baseline, like I said, pretty close to where you are in the mornings. If it's not a couple hours, 2.5 hours, then you're probably somewhat insulin resistant, unless this is massive carb meals. But you said 70 grams, which is not, I mean, that's nothing crazy. Added some more context. Yeah, I mean, that would mean the insulin sensitivity is pretty good. Yeah, there would be, the body clears the glucose just like it should. And you're not really, you're going to see it in the mirror. Are you gaining lots of fat? Are you still gaining muscle? But that would be relatively normal. If it's not returning, then you might have some insulin resistance, or the meal's too big, or you need to switch the carb source, or what have you. I'm not sure if that answers this question. I hope it does. Any specific time to consume breakfast? No. I mean, I actually, a lot of my clients, and not everyone, but a lot of people notice you're normally hungry right out of bed. That's normal. Hunger hormones are high. It's a waking response, but that kind of dies off after a little bit if you have some fluids and you get moving around. It's a good time to burn up some fatty acids in the morning. Can't hurt. Growth hormone's a little bit higher. So, I mean, that's a decent time to be active and get some things done. But it's not going to make a huge difference at the end of the day. Eat whenever, really. I mean, there's even, everyone's heard of like intermittent fasting and things like that, and I've had people use that with success, and your body's going to pretty much adapt to anything, unless you're not eating all day long. But it's not going to be a big deal if you don't eat within 30 minutes of waking up. I mean, that's not a big deal at all. Got a couple more. Best foods for carb intake in a load phase before a show. Honestly, whatever people are refeeding on, if they're doing refeeds in the prep, stick to those foods if you know they work. Or, if you're doing something off the plan, keep it a safe food. Don't make it anything crazy unless you know that you've used these foods before. If you're going to try a junk load or a shit load or something like that, and you've never used any of those foods, or they're just really off the wall foods, then you're just asking for it. You're asking for digestive issues or inflammation and so on and so forth. So basically stick to what you've used and have been eating. That's usually a safe bet. If you need to load on more calorically dense foods, still stick to safer foods for the most part. I mean, just use your brain. I mean, if you need to get fat loading, like for example, before my second contest, this worked pretty well. I had a fat loaded, but with carbs as well, and I had, I think it was a ribeye steak and French fries, and I've not had either of those in the prep. But I mean, it's safe stuff. It's not anything crazy. The only thing would maybe be the vegetable oil and the fries might upset my stomach a little bit, but it didn't in that quantity. It didn't really have any issues. Everything digested really good. But again, it wasn't like I was eating cake or Oreos or something crazy that I haven't had. It was potato with oil. So it's not, use your best judgment if you have to do something that you haven't had. My favorites, for my refeeds, I was doing typical stuff: cereal, rice, potatoes, Rice Krispie treats, rice cakes. I like the flavored kind, usually. I would use some frozen yogurt sometimes, although I cut that out at the end. I would use it's like gluten-free pastas and stuff like that, and but that was about it. There was maybe 6 to 8 different things I rotated through. Is there any reason outside of PCT to stack anti-E's? I really don't see any reason ever, to be honest. Although something like, they say, anastrozole and exemestane, they're not exactly the same in their mechanisms, but at the same time, I mean, unless it's like tiny doses of both, they're just going to crush your estrogen levels, absolutely crush them. Yeah, you could have in PCT, you're thinking estrogen rebound. I get that, but honestly, you can probably control it with something over the counter like DEM or a very low dose of aromacin. I don't see the reason to stack both. Truth about receptor site saturation. So basically maxing out receptors in a single blast, let's say. Yeah, I think that there's a point where more isn't necessarily going to do more. Receptor has to be able to uptake it, but and I believe I actually think this was Dave Crosland that said this, because he has a pretty good education on PEDs and has done some research and some different stuff. That receptor capability, I guess I'm going to call it receptor capability, actually increased through more time of usage. So like a veteran versus a novice, the veteran would be able to uptake more and benefit from more, which would make sense, because really your sensitivity to it's going to go down and you would need more. But yeah, I don't know that there's a number out there. I don't think that there's a study that's going to show you a number. I really don't think that exists. But I do think that obviously there's some ceiling to it. Now and we could get in also like some of Dan Duchesne's, some of his literature talking about like the I think it was like a post-cycle response, talking about the very short periods where it's super sensitive and that you could increase to a really high dosage. It's kind of a different question, but I think there might be a very short period window there. If you read some of his literature, he explains it really well, where you could potentially have a benefit from that. But in general, from what I've seen, literature-wise, and what I've heard, and like I said, what Dave talked about, for example, it's going to kind of depend on how long the person's been using, and you might have a little more receptor capability, as I called it, as time goes on. But at the end of the day, too, just to add to that, everyone metabolizes everything differently. It's going to be so person specific in how they metabolize the actual compound. Even on TRT, you look at a person that's prescribed the same amount, and one person's test levels go up to 800 and the other person's test levels go up to 1200 on the same exact dose, same exact timing, same exact brand, everything. They metabolize the drug differently. And there are definitely people like that. It's definitely going to be different person to person. Some people respond to very, very little. Thoughts on high frequency. This is the last one. Thoughts on high frequency, lower volume versus low frequency, higher volume based on your experience with clients. I'm currently getting the best results doing low frequency, which is going against the current norm. I think you could look at total volume throughout the weeks. Okay, so when people say high frequency, lower volume, your total volume is not really lower for the week. Your volume per session is lower, but your volume for the whole week isn't really lower. You're just splitting it up into more frequent workouts. Whereas the low frequency, higher volume, well, your volume's probably not really that much higher. You're just only hitting the muscle once a week. So really probably total volume is going to be the biggest determining factor in there. We know that it's a really important factor in muscle growth. So I would say that's probably first and foremost what you're looking at. Maybe you're doing more volume just in total and you're getting better results, or you're doing a volume that is good for you specifically. Whereas if you took that same volume that you're doing right now and split it up, you might still have the same result or better. So total, I would look at total volume first and foremost, and then frequency. The frequency is just more of a recoverability. You're going to recover better with less volume per muscle group and be able to do it more frequently, which would allow you probably more work, and you could probably get in more volume total that way, just because you're hitting it more frequently and you're recovering more frequently, versus hammering 25 sets of chest, and your chest is completely destroyed for 5 days or 7 days. So again, total volume in that equation is probably the most important thing. I'd be willing to bet that total volume, if you looked at it and you split it up into both scenarios, wouldn't be that much different. Higher frequency just seems to be better in terms of recovery and allowing you to push a little bit more total volume since it's split up. And I hope that makes sense. And that is it, guys. I am cutting it off here. This is way too long already. So thank you, and we will pick it up again next week.